The whip of cold air cut across the training yard, and Alira hit the ground before she even understood she had been struck. Her cheek burned. Dust filled her mouth. Somewhere above her, laughter rippled through the crowd of pack wolves who had gathered to watch the morning drills, and none of them moved to help her up. That was the rule of Moonfall Pack, spoken and unspoken alike. The weak stayed down until they learned to rise on their own, and even then, nobody offered a hand. She pushed herself onto her knees, feeling grit bite into her palms, and looked up at the wolf who had knocked her down. Corin, a broad-shouldered beta with a permanent sneer, stood over her with his arms crossed, clearly proud of himself for defeating an opponent who barely qualified as one. "Get up," he said, not because he wanted to fight her again, but because her stillness offended him. "Or are you going to lie there and cry like you did last time?" Alira did not cry. She had learned years ago that tears only made the mocking louder, so she swallowed the sting in her throat and stood, swaying only slightly. Her wolf, small and quiet inside her, curled tighter, as if trying to hide from the humiliation instead of answering it. That was the cruelest part of being an Omega with a weak wolf. The shame did not only come from outside, it lived inside her too, whispering that she deserved this. "That's enough," called Nadia from the edge of the yard, though her tone held no real concern. Nadia was Alira's older sister, and the difference between them could not have been more obvious if the moon itself had drawn a line down the middle of their family. Nadia had a strong wolf, quick reflexes, and the easy confidence of someone who had never once been struck down in front of an audience. "Corin, don't waste your morning on her. She's not worth the bruises on your knuckles." The crowd laughed again, and this time it hurt more than the fall had. Alira limped to the edge of the training yard, refusing to look at any of them, refusing to let the water building behind her eyes fall. She was 19 years old, and had spent every one of those years being reminded that she did not belong among strong wolves, not in strength, not in status, not in the eyes of a pack that measured worth only by how hard you could hit and how fast you could run. She found an empty corner near the old stone wall and pressed her back against it, letting the cool stones soak some of the heat out of her skin. From there she could see the whole yard, the sparring rings, the raised platform where the pack alpha sometimes stood to watch, and beyond it, the gates that led out toward the wider territories where packs greater and lesser than Moonfall lived under their own laws. She had heard the rumors that morning, whispered between servants carrying water jugs across the courtyard. A king was coming. Not a pack alpha, not a regional beta, but Cale Ashford, ruler of the Northern Territories, a wolf so powerful that even alphas lowered their eyes in his presence. He was said to have ended 3 wars before his 25th birthday and to have no patience for weakness of any kind. Alira felt her stomach twist at the thought. A visit from a king usually meant one thing for pack members like her: an inspection, a display, a parade of strength meant to prove Moonfall's worth as an ally. And weak wolves were never part of such displays. She would likely be hidden away for the day, kept out of sight so she would not embarrass her family in front of someone so powerful. That thought, at least, brought a small relief. Being invisible had its uses. By midday, the pack had transformed the courtyard into something resembling a stage. Banners were raised, the stone paths were swept clean, and every wolf capable of impressing a king was pulled into formation to await his arrival. Alira was not among them. She had been assigned, as usual, to the kitchens, where she spent the hours peeling roots and carrying trays, her hands raw from the work, her ears full of the excited chatter of wolves preparing to catch a glimpse of greatness. It was pure chance, bad luck, she would think later, that brought her back into the courtyard, just as the king's procession arrived. She had been sent to deliver a tray of bread to the outer hall, a task simple enough that no one thought to give it to someone more presentable. She was halfway across the courtyard, tray balanced carefully in her hands, when the great gates opened, and a line of dark-cloaked riders swept through, their wolves moving with a discipline that made every Moonfall wolf in the yard straighten instinctively. At the front of the procession rode a man who did not need a crown to announce what he was. Cale Ashford was tall in a way that made the space around him seem smaller, his shoulders set with the kind of stillness that came from absolute control rather than tension. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they swept briefly across the courtyard, held a coldness that made even the confident wolves of Moonfall lower their gazes. He wore no ceremonial armor, no unnecessary decoration. Power like his did not need to be dressed up. Alira froze at the edge of the yard, tray still in her hands, painfully aware that she had nowhere to hide without drawing attention to herself. She pressed herself against the nearest wall instead, hoping to become part of the stonework until the king passed. He did not pass quickly. The pack alpha, Garrett Voss, stepped forward to greet him with the exaggerated warmth of a man desperate to impress, bowing low and gesturing toward the assembled wolves as though presenting a prized collection. Kale dismounted without a word, his gaze moving over the courtyard with the detached interest of someone assessing livestock rather than meeting allies. It was in that sweep of his gaze that his eyes landed, for the briefest moment, on Alira. She did not know what he saw. A servant girl with a tray of bread, dust still faintly visible on her cheek from the morning's fall, standing too still against a wall. His eyes did not linger, why would they, and moved on almost immediately, back to Garrett, who was already speaking about the strength of his warriors, the loyalty of his pack, the honor of hosting such a visit. Alira exhaled slowly and told herself the moment meant nothing. Kings did not notice servants. She resumed her task, weaving carefully around the edge of the gathering, intending to deliver the bread and disappear back into the kitchens before anyone thought to question why she was there at all. Corin, apparently eager to prove something in front of the visiting king, chose that exact moment to demonstrate his authority. He caught sight of Alira crossing the yard, and, perhaps thinking it would look impressive to discipline a weak Omega in front of powerful guests, stepped into her path. "You're too slow," he said loudly, loud enough to be heard by the nearby wolves, loud enough, though he did not seem to realize it, to be heard by the king himself. "Everyone's watching, and you're stumbling around like you don't know where to put your feet." "I'm delivering bread," Alira said quietly, trying to step around him. "I'll be out of the way in a moment." "You're always in the way." Corin's hand closed around her arm, not gently, and the tray tilted dangerously. "Maybe you need reminding of your place." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, though Alira would replay it for days afterward, trying to understand it. Garrett's voice cracked across the yard first, sharp with fury not at Corin's cruelty, but at the disruption itself. "Corin, control yourself. We have guests." But it was too late. Corin's grip tightened. Alira's arm twisted awkwardly, and the tray of bread crashed to the stone ground between them, loud in the sudden silence that had fallen over the courtyard. Alira did not cry out. She had trained herself too well for that. Instead, she looked up, not at Corin, but past him, and found herself staring directly into the king's eyes. He was watching, not with idle curiosity, but with the focused attention of someone who had just witnessed something he did not like. "Release her," Kale said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Every wolf in the courtyard heard it as clearly as if he had shouted, and the temperature of the air itself seemed to drop several degrees. Corin's hand fell away from Alira's arm so fast, it was as though he had been burned. He stumbled back a step, his earlier confidence collapsing into something closer to panic. "My king, I did not ask for an explanation." Kale's gaze had not moved from Alira, and under the weight of it, she felt suddenly, uncomfortably visible, the opposite of the invisibility she had spent her whole life cultivating. "I asked you to release her, and you did so only after I spoke. That tells me everything I need to know about how this pack treats those who cannot defend themselves." Garrett hurried forward, his face pale with the effort of managing the disaster unfolding in front of his most important guest. "My king, I apologize. This girl is of little consequence, a servant, an Omega of weak blood. She is not worth your attention." "I did not ask whether she was worth my attention," Kale said, and something in his tone made even Garrett fall silent. "I am asking why a member of your pack thought it acceptable to put hands on someone who offered him no resistance and no reason to do so." Alira stood frozen, amid the wreckage of the bread tray, her arm still faintly aching where Corin had gripped it, acutely aware that every wolf in the courtyard was now watching her instead of the king. It was, she thought distantly, the worst possible way to finally be seen. Kale's eyes finally moved from her to survey the rest of the gathered pack, and whatever he found there did not seem to please him. He said nothing further about the incident. He simply turned back to Garrett and resumed the formal greetings as though nothing unusual had occurred, his voice returning to the same cool, measured tone he had used upon arrival. But Alira noticed something the others did not. too consumed with relief that the king's anger had passed to pay attention to the small details. Throughout the rest of the formal greeting, throughout the tour of the training grounds and the polite exchange of pleasantries between Garrett and his powerful guest, Kale's gaze returned to her corner of the courtyard more than once. Brief glances, nothing anyone else would think to track. But Alira tracked them, because she had spent her entire life learning to notice the exact moment someone's attention turned toward her, usually as a warning of what came next. She retreated to the kitchens as soon as she was able, gathering the ruined bread and the shattered tray with hands that trembled more than she wanted them to. Nadia found her there an hour later, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "You caused a scene," Nadia said. "I didn't cause anything. Corin grabbed me." In front of the king, Nadia said it like an accusation, as though the king's presence had somehow made Alira responsible for what happened to her. "Do you understand what could happen if he decides Moonfall is not worth his alliance because of something like this? Father is furious." Alira said nothing. There was nothing to say that Nadia would actually hear. "Just stay out of sight for the rest of his visit," Nadia continued, softening only slightly. "Whatever attention he gave you back there, it wasn't kindness. Kings like him don't notice Omegas like you unless something is wrong. Don't give him another reason to look." It was, Alira thought later that night, as she lay awake in the small room she shared with two other low-ranked Omegas, probably good advice. She intended to follow it. She had no interest in drawing further attention from a king whose reputation for ruthlessness was known even in the furthest corners of the Northern Territories. She wanted only to survive his visit unnoticed, the way she had survived every other significant event in her life. But even as she told herself this, she could not stop replaying the moment his eyes had found hers across the courtyard, not the cold assessment he had given the rest of the pack, but something else, something she did not have a name for, and did not trust herself to name. It had felt for one impossible second, like being truly seen for the first time in her life. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not concern themselves with weak Omegas. She did not yet know how wrong she was. The following morning, word spread through Moonfall Pack faster than fire through dry grass. The king had requested a private audience with Garrett Voss before his departure, and no one, not even Garrett's most trusted advisors, had been permitted to attend. Alira heard the news from the other kitchen workers, delivered in hushed, anxious tones. Everyone certain that whatever was discussed behind those closed doors would determine the fate of the entire pack's standing with the Northern Territories. She had no reason to think it concerned her. She was proven wrong within the hour, when a guard she did not recognize found her scrubbing pots in the kitchen and informed her, without explanation, that she was to report to the Great Hall immediately. Her hands went cold despite the steam rising from the washing basin. "Why?" "I wasn't told why," the guard said, not unkindly, though his eyes held a wariness that told her he suspected something significant was happening, something far above his understanding. "I was only told to bring you." Alira dried her hands on her apron, smoothed down her hair as best she could, and followed him out of the kitchens with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Whatever was waiting in the Great Hall, she understood with sudden, terrible clarity, was about to change everything. She just did not yet know how much. The Great Hall of Moonfall Pack had never felt so large to Alira as it did the moment she stepped through its doors and found Cale Ashford waiting there alone, with Garrett Voss standing beside him wearing an expression she had never seen on her Pack Alpha's face before. Fear. She stopped just inside the entrance, unsure whether to bow, unsure whether to speak, unsure of anything except the frantic beat of her own heart. The hall's high windows let in pale morning light that cut across the stone floor in long strips, and Cale stood in the center of one of them, his dark cloak absorbing the light rather than reflecting it, as though even the sun hesitated to touch him too closely. "Come forward," Cale said, and though his voice carried none of the harshness she remembered from the courtyard, it left no room for hesitation. Alira walked toward him, each step feeling heavier than the last, painfully aware of Garrett's eyes following her, with an expression somewhere between confusion and dread. She stopped a respectful distance away and lowered her gaze, as was proper when addressing someone of such high standing. "Look at me," Cale said. She lifted her eyes, startled. Omegas of her rank were rarely told to meet the gaze of anyone above them, let alone a king. But she obeyed, and found him studying her with the same unreadable focus he had shown in the courtyard the day before. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elira," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Elira Voss, my king." Something flickered behind his eyes at the surname, though she could not tell what it meant. "Elira," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "Tell me what happened yesterday. In your own words, not your alpha's." She glanced instinctively toward Garrett, who gave the smallest, tensest shake of his head, a silent warning to say as little as possible. But Cale's attention did not waver from her face, and something about his stillness told her that lying to him, or even softening the truth, would be a far greater risk than telling it plainly. "I was crossing the courtyard with a tray," she said carefully. "Corin told me I was in the way. When I tried to move past him, he grabbed my arm. That's all, my king. It was a small thing." "It was not a small thing," Cale said, and the certainty in his voice made both Elira and Garrett go still. "A wolf twice your size laid hands on someone offering no resistance, in front of his entire pack, in front of visiting guests, and no one moved to stop him until I spoke. That is not a small thing. That is a pattern, and I do not believe yesterday was the first time it has happened to you." Elira said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. The truth was that it was far from the first time, that she had lost count of the number of moments like it across her 19 years, that the entire pack had long ago decided her weakness made such treatment acceptable, even deserved. But admitting that in front of Garrett felt like inviting punishment far worse than anything Corin had done. Cale seemed to read the silence correctly, because his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned his attention fully to Garrett. "I have made inquiries this morning," he said, "regarding the treatment of Omegas within your pack, and specifically regarding this one. What I have learned does not reflect well on your leadership." Garrett's face drained of color. "My king, whatever you have heard, I assure you. I do not require your assurances. I require a solution." Cale's tone remained level, almost conversational, which somehow made it more unsettling than if he had shouted. "I am placing Elira Voss under my personal guardianship, effective immediately. She will accompany me to the capital upon my departure this afternoon." The words landed in the hall like a physical blow. Elira's breath caught, certain she had misheard, certain there was some other meaning hidden in his words that made sense of a sentence that otherwise felt impossible. Kings did not take Omegas of weak blood into their personal guardianship. It simply did not happen. There was no precedent for it in any story she had ever heard. No reason for a ruler as powerful as Cale Ashford to concern himself with someone as insignificant as her. "My king," Garrett said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. "Surely this is unnecessary. I can discipline Corin myself. I can ensure nothing of this nature happens again. There is no need to trouble yourself with—" "This is not a discussion, Garrett." For the first time since Elira had entered the hall, Cale's voice sharpened, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop with it. "It is a command. You will not question it, and you will not attempt to alter it after my departure. Elira comes with me. Is that understood?" Garrett's throat worked visibly before he managed a stiff nod. "Understood, my king." Cale turned back to Elira, and whatever hardness had entered his voice while addressing Garrett softened, though only slightly, when directed at her. "You will need to gather your belongings. We leave within the hour." Elira found her voice at last, though it came out thinner than she intended. "My king, may I ask why?" It was a bold question, bordering on inappropriate, and she saw Garrett's eyes widen in alarm at her audacity. But Cale did not seem offended by it. If anything, something in his expression shifted, as though he had expected the question and had been waiting for it. "Not now," he said, not unkindly. "There will be time for answers later. For now, understand only this. No one in this pack, or any pack under my authority, will lay a hand on you again without answering to me directly. That is not a courtesy, it is a fact." She did not understand. She would spend the following weeks turning the moment over and over in her mind, searching for the explanation that made sense of it, and finding none that satisfied her. But standing there in the great hall, with Garrett pale and silent beside her, and the king's dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity she had no name for, she understood one thing clearly. Her life, whatever shape it had taken across 19 years of quiet suffering, was about to change entirely, and there was no version of refusal available to her. She bowed her head, murmured her acceptance, and left the hall to pack what little she owned into a single worn bag. News of the king's decision spread through Moonfall Pack before she had even finished folding her few dresses. By the time she crossed the courtyard again, this time toward the line of riders preparing for departure, every wolf in the pack seemed to have gathered to watch, their expressions ranging from disbelief to open resentment. Nadia found her at the edge of the group, her face a careful mask that did not quite hide the confusion underneath. "I don't understand what he wants with you," Nadia said, low enough that only Alira could hear. "This isn't kindness, Alira. Kings don't do things like this without reason, and whatever his reason is, it isn't going to be simple." "I know," Alira said quietly. "I don't understand it either." "Then be careful." For a moment, something that might have been genuine concern flickered across Nadia's features, quickly buried beneath her usual composure. "Whatever he wants from you, don't assume it's safe, just because he's stopped others from hurting you. Power like his always has a price." Alira had no response to that, because some quiet, cautious part of her agreed completely. She thanked her sister for the warning, though she suspected Nadia's concern was as much about the pack's reputation as it was about her, and made her way toward the waiting riders. Kale was already mounted, his dark cloak settled around him, his expression unreadable as he watched the pack gather to witness her departure. He said nothing as she approached, only gestured toward a second horse that had been prepared for her, its saddle plain but well made, clearly chosen with more care than she had expected. "Can you ride?" he asked, the first words he had spoken to her since the Great Hall. "A little," she admitted, "not well." Something that was almost, though not quite, amusement passed briefly across his face. "Then you will ride with one of my guards until you learn better." He gestured, and a broad-shouldered wolf with kind eyes and an easy smile guided his horse forward. "This is Finn," Kale said. "He will see to your safety on the journey, and beyond it, until other arrangements are made." Finn offered her a small, reassuring nod as she was helped onto the horse behind him, and Alira found herself grateful for even that small kindness, amid a day that had upended everything she understood about her place in the world. As the procession began to move, gates opening ahead of them onto the road that led north toward the capital, Alira allowed herself one final glance back at Moonfall Pack, at the training yard where she had been struck down more times than she could count, at the kitchens where she had spent countless hours unseen and unvalued, at the family who had never once stood between her and the world's cruelty. She felt no sadness at leaving it behind, only a deep, uncertain wariness about what lay ahead, and beneath that wariness, something she refused to name, small and fragile and impossible to trust, the faint, dangerous beginning of hope. Kale rode at the front of the procession, silent and unreachable, and did not look back once. But Alira, watching the straight line of his shoulders against the pale morning sky, could not shake the feeling that whatever had brought her into his guardianship was far larger than a single moment of cruelty in a courtyard, and that the true reason still waited somewhere ahead of her, patient and unspoken, in the capital she had never seen. The capital rose out of the northern hills like something carved rather than built, its walls pale stone against a sky heavy with clouds, its towers taller than anything Alira had seen in her life. She had grown up believing Moonfall's stronghold was impressive, with its high walls and its guarded gates, but next to Kale's capital, it looked like little more than a modest farmhouse beside a mountain. The journey had taken 3 days, most of it spent in tense silence, broken only by Finn's occasional attempts at conversation, which Alira answered politely but briefly, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening to manage much more. Kale himself had said little to her during the ride, riding always at the front, occasionally sending back instructions to his guards but never once initiating conversation with her directly. She had begun to wonder if the moment in the Great Hall had been some strange exception, soon to be forgotten once she was settled somewhere out of his sight. That assumption did not survive their arrival. The stronghold's inner courtyard was even grander than its outer walls suggested, filled with wolves whose bearing spoke of status and training far beyond anything Moonfall could boast. They turned to watch the procession arrive with open curiosity, and Alira felt their eyes catch on her immediately. A plain, travel-worn Omega, riding behind one of the king's personal guards, utterly out of place among warriors and nobles. Whispers followed her from the moment she dismounted. Who is she? Did the king bring back a servant? No, look at how she's dressed. She can't be anyone important. Illyra kept her eyes forward, doing her best to ignore the murmurs, though each one landed with the same familiar sting she had spent her whole life learning to absorb. Some things, it seemed, followed a person regardless of how far they traveled. Cale dismounted, and, to the visible surprise of the gathered wolves, walked directly toward her, rather than toward the officials already moving to greet him. "You'll be given quarters near the eastern wing," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she and Finn could hear it clearly. "Finn will show you the way, and you'll have everything you need brought to you today. Rest first. We will speak properly once you've settled." "Thank you, my king," Illyra said, because it felt like the only appropriate response, though gratitude was a strange, unfamiliar shape in her mouth after so many years of expecting nothing from anyone above her. Something crossed his expression too quickly for her to identify before he turned away, already being pulled into the demands of his position by a cluster of advisors eager for his attention. Illyra watched him go, struck again by how completely the courtyard seemed to reorganize itself around his presence, every wolf adjusting their posture, their tone, their very breathing to accommodate the weight of him. Finn guided her through the stronghold's winding halls, pointing out landmarks she'd barely registered: the great dining hall, the training grounds, the covered walkway that connected the eastern wing to the main keep, until they arrived at a modest but comfortable room, with a real bed, a washing basin, and a window that looked out over gardens more beautiful than anything Illyra had imagined existing outside of stories. "This is mine?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "All yours," Finn confirmed, something warm in his expression. "I know it's a lot to take in. Believe me, half the court is asking the same questions you probably are." "And you don't know the answer either?" Finn hesitated, and in that hesitation, Illyra understood that he knew more than he was willing to share. "That's not my story to tell," he said gently, "but I'll say this much. The king doesn't do anything without reason. I've served him for 6 years, and I've never once seen him act carelessly. Whatever this is, it matters to him." It was not the reassurance Illyra had hoped for, but it was honest, and she found herself grateful for that honesty, even as it deepened rather than eased her uncertainty. The following days settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Illyra was given simple but well-made clothing, meals delivered to her room by quiet, watchful servants, and enough freedom to explore parts of the stronghold that did not require special permission. She avoided the busier halls where nobles gathered, uncomfortable under the weight of their curious, judging stares, and instead found herself drawn to the gardens Finn had shown her, where she could sit undisturbed among flowering vines and listen to birdsong instead of whispered speculation. It was in those gardens, 4 days after her arrival, that she encountered Cale's cousin for the first time. She did not know his name at first, only that he approached with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed, his dark eyes assessing her with open, unfriendly curiosity. He was handsome in a sharp, calculated way that reminded her uncomfortably of Corin, though his cruelty, she would soon learn, wore a far more polished mask. "So you're the girl," he said, settling onto the bench across from her without invitation. "The one my cousin dragged all the way from some backwater pack to protect. I've heard several theories about why, none of them particularly flattering to you." "I don't believe we've met," Illyra said carefully, refusing to let his tone provoke a reaction. "Callum," he said, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Cale's cousin, third in line, should anything unfortunate happen to him, which I sincerely hope it never does." The pause before that last phrase carried a weight that made Illyra's instincts prickle with wariness. "Tell me, Illyra, what exactly makes you worth a king's personal guardianship? Because from where I'm sitting, you don't look like much of anything." "I don't know," she said honestly, refusing to be baited into either false modesty or defensive anger. "I've asked myself the same question." Something flickered across Callum's face, surprise perhaps, at her directness, before his smile sharpened into something colder. "Careful with that honesty. Not everyone here will find it as charming as I do." He rose from the bench, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. "A word of advice, since you're clearly new to how things work in a court like this. Whatever protection Cale has offered you, it won't last forever. Kings grow bored of their projects eventually. When that happens, I'd advise you to already have somewhere else to go." He left without waiting for a response, and Alira sat alone in the garden long after his footsteps had faded, turning his words over with the same careful suspicion she applied to everything in this unfamiliar world. She did not trust him, not even slightly, but she could not entirely dismiss the fear he had planted either. What if he was right? What if this guardianship was temporary, a passing whim from a powerful man who would eventually tire of it, leaving her stranded in a court that had never wanted her? That evening, as the sun set golden and heavy over the gardens, Alira found herself unexpectedly summoned to a private meeting with Kale for the first time since their arrival. He received her in a modest study rather than the grand hall she had expected, seated behind a desk covered in maps and correspondence, the window behind him letting in the last warm light of the day. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, hands folded carefully in her lap, uncertain what this meeting would bring. "How are you settling in?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, caught her off guard with its ordinariness. "Well enough," she said. "Everyone has been accommodating, but not welcoming." It was not a question. He seemed to read the truth in her hesitation, without needing her to voice it. "The court is not always kind to those it does not understand. I imagine my cousin has already introduced himself." Alira's surprise must have shown on her face, because something that might have been the faint ghost of amusement touched his mouth. "Callum makes a habit of testing anyone new to court. Don't take his words too seriously, though I won't pretend they carry no weight at all. He has ambitions, and he does not always express them wisely. He suggested your protection of me wouldn't last," Alira said, deciding honesty was safer than pretending the conversation had not troubled her. Something hardened behind Kale's eyes, quick and sharp. "Then let me be clear, so there is no confusion for you, for Callum, or for anyone else in this court." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on hers, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "My protection of you is not temporary, and it is not a whim. Whatever you were led to believe about your worth in Moonfall Pack, understand this now. It was wrong. You are under my guardianship, and that means no one touches you, threatens you, or diminishes you without answering directly to me. That will not change." The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, and something in Alira's chest loosened slightly, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but I still don't understand why. Please, my king, I need to understand why." Kale studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes, before he finally spoke. "There are things about you that you do not yet know, Alira. Things I am not yet certain enough to share, because I would rather be sure than risk giving you false hope over something I cannot yet prove." "What things?" "Patience," he said, and though the word might have sounded dismissive from anyone else, from him, it carried something closer to a promise. "I will tell you everything, when the time is right. For now, I need you to trust that I would not have brought you here, would not have made the decree I made in front of your entire pack, without a reason significant enough to justify it." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was, she realized, more honesty than she had received from almost anyone in her entire life. She nodded slowly, accepting the incomplete truth for what it was, and something in Kale's posture eased slightly in response, as though her acceptance had mattered to him more than he expected it to. "There is one more thing," he added, as she rose to leave. "Tomorrow, you will begin training with one of my guards, not the kind of training you received at Moonfall." His jaw tightened faintly at the memory. "Real training. It is time someone taught you to defend yourself properly, so that no one ever again has the opportunity to put their hands on you without consequence." Alira felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest at those words. Not quite hope, not quite trust, but something adjacent to both, fragile and new, and entirely unlike anything she had felt in Moonfall's cold, judging halls. She left the study with her mind full of questions still unanswered, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found herself looking forward to whatever came next, instead of dreading it. She did not yet know how much that single feeling would come to matter. The training yard Kale had spoken of bore no resemblance to the one Alira remembered from Moonfall. It was smaller, quieter, tucked behind the eastern wing, where the sound of clashing weapons would not disturb the court's daily business, and when she arrived the next morning, Only one wolf waited for her there, instead of a crowd eager to watch her fail. Her name was Mira, and she was unlike anyone Alira had encountered in her life. A tall, weathered woman, with silver threading through dark hair, and the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence in her own strength. She did not sneer at Alira's arrival, did not measure her with the dismissive glance Alira had grown used to receiving from stronger wolves. She simply studied her, the way a craftsman studies raw material before deciding what it might become. "The king tells me you've never had proper training," Mira said, circling her slowly. "I've had training," Alira said. "It just never worked. There's a difference between training and punishment dressed up as training." Something sharp flickered in Mira's expression. "I've heard how Moonfall treats its weaker wolves. We're not doing that here. Here, we start from the beginning, and we build honestly." She stopped in front of Alira, studying her posture, her stance, the way she held herself with the perpetual, defensive tension of someone who had spent years expecting to be struck. "First lesson, stand like you belong in your own body." It was such a strange instruction that Alira almost laughed, except Mira's expression remained perfectly serious. "I don't understand. You're standing like you're trying to disappear. Shoulders curled in, chin down, weight on your back foot like you're ready to run at any moment." Mira reached out, not unkindly, and adjusted Alira's stance with careful, deliberate hands. "That's not a fighting stance. That's a surviving stance. There's a difference, and it's the first thing we're going to change." Over the following weeks, Alira's days took on a new shape entirely. Mornings were spent in the training yard with Mira, learning not the brute force techniques she had always assumed strength required, but balance, timing, the careful reading of an opponent's movement before they made it. Her wolf, small and long, silenced by years of shame, began to stir in ways it never had at Moonfall, responding to instruction rather than fear, for what felt like the first time in her life. Afternoons were quieter, spent in the gardens or in the modest library Finn had shown her, where she began teaching herself to read documents beyond the simple texts she had grown up with. She avoided the busier halls of the stronghold still, uncomfortable under the court's continued curiosity, though she noticed, slowly, that the whispers around her had begun to shift in tone, less mockery now, more genuine confusion about who exactly she was, to warrant such careful attention. Cale remained a distant, but constant presence throughout those weeks. He did not seek her out often, his days consumed by the endless demands of ruling a territory as vast as his, but when their paths crossed, in a hallway, at the edge of the training yard where he sometimes paused to watch her progress without comment, during the rare evening meal they shared in his study rather than the great hall, something in his manner toward her had softened in ways she could not quite name. It was during one such evening, weeks into her stay, that she first saw past the composed authority he wore, like armor in front of the court. She had been summoned to his study to discuss her progress with Mira, a routine check-in that had become almost comfortable in its familiarity, when she noticed the deep lines of exhaustion carved into his face, the way his shoulders sat lower than usual, weighed down by something beyond simple tiredness. "You look tired," she said, before she could stop herself, immediately uncertain whether such an observation was appropriate to offer a king. Cale glanced up from the correspondence scattered across his desk, something flickering across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, that she had noticed it all. "It has been a difficult week," he admitted, more openly than she expected. "Border disputes to the east, 2 packs on the verge of conflict that I have spent the last 3 days trying to resolve without bloodshed. Did you succeed?" "For now." He set down the paper he had been holding, rubbing a hand across his face, in a gesture that struck her as startlingly human, for someone who commanded such absolute authority. "Peace is rarely permanent. It only ever buys time." "That sounds exhausting," Alira said quietly. "Carrying that much responsibility." Something shifted in his expression, a rare vulnerability she had not seen from him before. "It is. Most days, I do not allow myself to think about it too closely, because there is no room for exhaustion in what I do. Every pack under my authority depends on decisions I make being correct, and there is no one above me to correct my mistakes if I make them." "That sounds lonely too," she said, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped. But Cale did not seem offended by the observation. If anything, something in his posture eased slightly, as though the simple acknowledgement of his loneliness, rarely spoken aloud by anyone in his life, offered a small relief he had not realized he needed. "It is," he admitted, "more than most people understand. Everyone around me wants something. Alliances, favors, protection, position. It becomes difficult to remember what it feels like to have a conversation that isn't, in some way, a negotiation." Alira considered this for a moment, turning it over carefully before she spoke. "I don't want anything from you," she said finally. "I mean, I'm grateful for everything you've done, more than I know how to say, but I'm not trying to negotiate anything. I just want to understand." Something in his dark eyes softened at that, an expression she had not seen from him before, warm in a way that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "I know," he said quietly. "That is, perhaps, why I find myself telling you things I do not tell anyone else." The words settled between them, quiet and significant, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the study filled only with the soft crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the wind moving through the gardens outside. Alira found herself studying him in the firelight, not the king the court saw, cold and untouchable, but the man beneath that armor, tired and burdened and, for reasons she still did not fully understand, willing to let her see it. "Thank you," she said eventually, "for trusting me with that." Cale's mouth curved into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "I suspect I will need someone to remind me of this conversation the next time I forget how to rest." It was, she realized later, walking back to her quarters beneath a sky scattered with stars she had never learned to name, the first time since arriving at the capital, that she had felt something other than uncertainty about her place there. She still did not know why Cale had brought her into his guardianship, still carried Callum's warning like a small, persistent weight at the back of her mind. But sitting across from him in that quiet study, watching the careful walls he kept raised for the rest of the world lower, just slightly, just for her, she found herself beginning to hope for something she had never allowed herself to want before, not just safety, but belonging. She did not yet understand how dangerous that hope would prove to be, nor how soon the fragile peace of those quiet weeks would be shattered by a truth neither of them was fully prepared for. The great hall of the capital was filled to capacity for the autumn gathering, a formal event Alira had been dreading for days, ever since Finn informed her that her presence would be expected for the first time since her arrival. Nobles from across the northern territories had traveled to attend, along with representatives from allied pacts, all gathered beneath the hall's soaring ceiling to feast, negotiate, and, as Alira quickly discovered, gossip. She stood near the edge of the hall in a gown Finn had helped her choose, feeling desperately out of place among wolves whose confidence seemed woven into the very fabric of their clothing. She had hoped to remain unnoticed, but word of the king's mysterious guardianship had clearly spread far beyond Moonfall's borders, and she felt the weight of curious stares from every direction the moment she entered. "There she is," murmured a cluster of nobles nearby, not bothering to lower their voices enough to spare her the humiliation of overhearing. "The Omega he brought back from that backwater pack. I still don't understand what he sees in her." "Perhaps nothing," another voice replied, cool and amused. "Perhaps it's simply a passing fascination. Kings are entitled to their curiosities, even strange ones." Alira kept her chin level, refusing to let the words show on her face, though they landed with familiar precision, against old wounds she had thought, foolishly, might have begun to heal. Across the hall she caught sight of Cale deep in conversation, with a cluster of visiting alphas, his attention fully occupied by the demands of diplomacy, and she understood with a sinking clarity that tonight, at least, she would have to navigate this world alone. She retreated toward a quieter corner near the tall windows, hoping to wait out the evening with minimal exposure to further scrutiny, when Callum appeared beside her, with the same unhurried confidence he had shown in the garden weeks earlier. "Struggling to enjoy the festivities?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with calculation. "I'm fine," Alira said, keeping her voice level, despite the wariness she felt in his presence. "Of course you are." He leaned against the window frame, studying the crowded hall with the detached amusement of someone who had grown up entirely comfortable in rooms like this. "You know, I've been doing some research since we last spoke, into your family, into Moonfall's history." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "It's remarkably difficult to find clear records of the Voss bloodline before 3 generations ago. almost as if something was deliberately erased. Alira's stomach tightened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. I don't know anything about that. No, Callum agreed, something calculating in his smile. I don't imagine you do, but someone erased those records for a reason, and I intend to find out why, before my cousin decides to share whatever secret he's clearly keeping about you. He straightened, adjusting his sleeve with practiced elegance. A word of caution, Alira. Secrets in a court like this have a way of becoming very dangerous, very quickly, once the wrong people learn to ask the right questions. He left her standing alone by the window, his words settling into her chest like cold water, confirming fears she had not allowed herself to fully examine since her conversation with Cale in his study. Whatever truth he was withholding from her, it seemed increasingly clear that others in this court were already circling it, hungry for whatever advantage such knowledge might provide. She spent the remainder of the evening in careful, guarded silence, speaking only when directly addressed, declining the few dances offered by nobles more curious than genuinely interested in her company. It was well past midnight, the hall beginning to thin as guests retired to their quarters, when Cale finally found her again, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent hours navigating careful political conversation. You survived your first gathering, he said, something wry in his tone, as he settled beside her near the window. Barely, Alira admitted. Your cousin made sure of that. Cale's expression sharpened immediately. What did he say to you? She hesitated, weighing whether to share Callum's implications, before deciding that continued silence would serve no one well. He said he's been researching my family, that there are gaps in the records before 3 generations ago. He thinks something was deliberately erased. Something dangerous flickered across Cale's face, quickly suppressed beneath his usual composure, though Alira had spent enough weeks in his presence now to recognize the difference between his genuine calm and the careful mask he wore when concealing something significant. Callum is perceptive, he said carefully, more perceptive than I would like, in this instance. So it's true, Alira said quietly. There is something about my family, about why you brought me here. Cale was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the darkened gardens beyond the window rather than on her. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and careful, as though even here, in a mostly empty hall, the words felt dangerous to say aloud. I have been searching for the right moment to tell you the truth since the day I met you in that courtyard. I have delayed longer than I should have, because once you know, there will be no undoing that knowledge, and I wanted to be certain before I placed that weight on you. Please, Alira said, and something in her voice must have carried the full weight of weeks spent wondering, because Cale finally turned to look at her, his dark eyes holding a seriousness that made her breath catch. Not here, he said. Tomorrow. I will show you everything, and you will understand why I could not let you remain in a pack that had no idea what they were letting go of. His hand moved, briefly, as though to reach for hers, before he seemed to catch himself and let it fall back to his side. I am sorry to have made you wait this long. I only wanted to be certain, before I gave you a truth that will change everything, that it was one you were ready to carry. Alira nodded slowly, her mind racing with possibilities she could not fully articulate, and beneath the uncertainty, something else stirred, a quiet, persistent awareness of how close he stood, of the careful restraint in the way he had almost reached for her hand, of the warmth that had settled between them across the past weeks, despite everything neither of them had said aloud. Whatever it is, she said quietly, thank you for telling me it all. I think I've spent my whole life being the last person to know anything about my own worth. I'd rather hear a difficult truth from you than keep wondering. Something in Cale's expression softened at that, warm and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen from him, and for a moment, standing together in the quiet hall long after the gathering had ended, the careful distance between a king and the Omega, under his protection, seemed to thin into something far less certain, far more dangerous, than either of them had been prepared to acknowledge. Neither of them spoke of it, but neither of them stepped away, either. The following morning, true to his word, Cale sent for her before the sun had fully risen, and led her not to his study, but to a part of the stronghold she had never seen before, a heavily guarded archive buried deep beneath the keep, filled with records older than anything she had encountered in her life. It was there, surrounded by dust and centuries of carefully preserved history, that Cale Ashford finally began to tell her the truth about who she really was. She did not yet know that the truth would put a target on her back that no amount of training could fully prepare her for. The archive smelled of old parchment and cold stone, its shelves stretching upward into shadow far beyond the reach of the lanterns Cale carried as he led her deeper into the vault. Alira followed close behind, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread she could not fully separate from each other. "This place holds records going back further than most packs remember existing," Cale said, setting his lantern down on a long wooden table, already scattered with documents he had clearly prepared in advance. Bloodlines, treaties, histories that most wolves alive today have never heard, because they were deliberately buried generations ago. "Buried by who?" Alira asked, moving closer to examine the documents, though the old script meant little to her untrained eye. "By your own ancestors, in part," Cale said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. "Alira, what I am about to tell you will sound impossible. I would not blame you for doubting it, but I have spent weeks confirming what my instincts told me the moment I first scented you in that courtyard, and I am certain now beyond any doubt." He pulled one document forward, its edges brittle with age, and turned it toward her. She could make out a family tree, elaborate and sprawling, though most of the names meant nothing to her. "This is the Voss bloodline," Cale said, tracing a line down the page with careful fingers, "as it existed 6 generations ago, before a decision was made that changed everything for every descendant who came after." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "Your family was not always weak, Alira. 6 generations ago, the Voss line carried some of the strongest wolf blood in the Northern Territories, connected to an ancient lineage so powerful that other packs feared what might happen if that strength ever consolidated fully under one leader." Alira stared at the document, struggling to reconcile the story with everything she had always understood about her family's place in the world. "That's not possible. My family has always been weak. Nadia is the only one with any real strength, and even she isn't." "Nadia's strength is a fraction of what should exist naturally in your bloodline," Cale interrupted gently. "And yours, Alira, should have been greater still, if not for what was done to prevent it." "What was done?" Cale exhaled slowly, and for the first time since she had met him, Alira saw something that looked almost like reluctance cross his features, as though the truth he was about to share carried a weight he did not relish placing on her. "A ritual suppression, performed on your bloodline generations ago, deliberately weakening the wolf within each descendant to prevent the line from ever rising to the power it was capable of. It was done, according to these records, at the request of rival packs terrified of what an unchecked Voss lineage might become, and it was maintained across every generation since, passed down through blood, weakening a little further with each new descendant." Alira felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she had not moved at all. "You're saying I was never actually weak, that something was done to make me this way?" "Yes." Cale's voice was steady, certain, though gentle, in a way that told her he understood exactly how much this truth would upend everything she believed about herself. "Your weak wolf, the suppressed shift you've struggled with your entire life, none of it was natural. It was inflicted, deliberately, generations before you were even born, and it has only grown weaker with each descendant carrying the suppression forward." She sank slowly into the chair beside the table, her mind struggling to hold the shape of everything he was telling her. 19 years of humiliation, of being struck down and mocked and dismissed as fundamentally, irreversibly weak, and none of it had ever been true. It had been done to her, to generations of her family before her, by people who had feared what she might have become. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family, my pack. Surely someone must have known." "I believe your family lost the knowledge generations ago," Cale said carefully. "Suppression rituals like this were designed to erase memory of themselves as thoroughly as they erased strength, so that each generation would simply believe the weakness was natural, inherited, permanent. It is possible no one alive in Moonfall Pack today has any idea what was truly done to your bloodline. But you knew," Alira said, "the moment you saw me. You said you scented something." Something in Cale's expression shifted, careful and deliberate, as he chose his next words. "Wolves as strong as mine are trained from birth to recognize the traces of ancient bloodlines, even suppressed ones, because such bloodlines carry political significance, regardless of how weakened they have become. The moment I scented you in that courtyard, I knew immediately that something extraordinary lay beneath the surface of what everyone else saw. I did not yet know the full history, but I knew enough to understand that leaving you in a pack that so thoroughly failed to recognize your worth would have been an injustice I could not accept. Alira absorbed this in silence, turning the impossible truth over in her mind, searching for some way to make it feel real, rather than like a story someone else was living. So this whole time, she said slowly, your protection of me, it was never really about kindness. It was about what I might become. Something flashed across Cale's face, sharp and immediate, as though the suggestion wounded him more than he wanted to admit. That is not true, he said, his voice carrying an intensity she had not expected. I will not deny that your bloodline first caught my attention, that it gave me reason to intervene, where I might not otherwise have had the standing to do so without political complication. But Alira, the guardianship I offered you, the protection I have given you across these weeks, none of that was calculated. I did not know, that first day in the courtyard, watching you refuse to break beneath a wolf twice your size, that I would come to care for the person beneath that bloodline as much as I did the bloodline itself. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unplanned, and Alira watched something like surprise flicker across Cale's own expression, as though he had not intended to say quite so much. I care for you, he continued, more quietly now, not because of what your ancestors were, or what you might become if this suppression were ever lifted. I care for you because of who you already are, someone who endured 19 years of cruelty without ever losing the strength to look someone twice her size directly in the eye. That is not something any ritual gave you, and it is not something any ritual could ever take away. Alira felt tears gathering, unexpected and overwhelming, and for once did not fight to hold them back. 19 years of being told she was worthless, and here, in this quiet archive buried beneath a king's stronghold, she was finally hearing the truth. Not just about her bloodline, but about herself, spoken by someone whose opinion had come, somehow, across these strange and uncertain weeks, to matter more than she had ever expected it to. What happens now? She asked eventually, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. If this suppression can be lifted, it is possible, Cale said carefully. The old records suggest a ritual exists that could reverse what was done, restoring your bloodline's natural strength. But it is dangerous, Alira. The suppression has weakened your body's connection to your wolf so thoroughly, across generations, that forcing a sudden reversal could be more than your body is able to survive. But it's possible, she repeated. It's possible, he confirmed, something careful and protective entering his voice. Though I would not ask it of you, not unless there were no other choice. For now, I would rather you simply understand the truth of who you are, and decide for yourself, in your own time, what you wish to do with that knowledge. Alira nodded slowly, though even as she did, some quiet, determined part of her had already begun turning the possibility over, testing its shape, wondering what it might feel like to finally exist as she was always meant to. She did not yet know how soon that choice would be forced upon her, nor how little time she would have to make it once the danger Callum had warned her of finally arrived at the capital's gates. For now, walking back up from the archive beside Cale, the weight of 19 years of false weakness beginning to lift from her shoulders for the first time in her life, Alira allowed herself, cautiously, to feel something she had never truly felt before. Hope, real and solid, standing firmly on ground that finally felt like it might hold. News, Alira quickly learned, traveled through a royal court faster than through any pack, no matter how carefully guarded the secret. Within a week of her visit to the archive, she began noticing subtle shifts in how the court regarded her. Fewer dismissive whispers, more calculating glances, as though something in the air itself had communicated that she was no longer simply a curiosity, but a question worth taking seriously. She confronted Cale about it during one of their now regular evening meetings in his study, unable to shake the growing unease that had settled over her since the revelation in the archive. People are looking at me differently, she said, settling into the chair that had, over the weeks, become unofficially hers, not the way they did before. Something's changed. Cale's expression darkened slightly, confirming her suspicion before he even spoke. I had hoped to keep the truth of your bloodline contained longer than this. It seems that hope was optimistic. Callum, Alira said immediately. remembering his pointed comments in the Great Hall weeks earlier. Likely, Cale admitted, frustration evident in the tight set of his jaw. Though I cannot prove it directly, my cousin has always had a talent for learning things he shouldn't, and an even greater talent for ensuring that knowledge serves his own interests, rather than remaining contained. What does it mean, Elira asked carefully, if the wrong people find out what I might become? Cale was quiet for a long moment, and in his silence, Elira felt her earlier hope curdle slowly into something closer to fear. It means, he said finally, that packs who once feared your bloodline enough to suppress it generations ago may fear it again, now that suppression has been discovered. An unclaimed bloodline, with the potential for that kind of strength, represents both an opportunity and a threat to anyone with ambitions of their own. Some will want to control it, others will want to eliminate it before it can ever be restored. The word eliminate landed heavily between them, and Elira felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. You mean someone might try to hurt me? I mean I will not allow that to happen, Cale said, his voice hardening with an intensity that left no room for doubt. But yes, I would be failing you if I pretended the danger wasn't real. I have already increased the guard around your quarters, and I will be assigning additional protection whenever you leave the stronghold from now on. Elira absorbed this in silence, the fragile hope she had carried since the archive, now tangled uncomfortably with a fear she had not anticipated needing to face so soon. I don't want to live behind walls of guards for the rest of my life, she said quietly. I only just started learning to defend myself. I don't want to go back to being someone who needs constant protection. Something in Cale's expression softened at that, understanding rather than dismissing her frustration. You won't be, forever. Mira tells me your progress has been remarkable, faster than she expected for someone with a suppressed bloodline. But Elira, until we know exactly who is aware of the truth, and what they intend to do with that knowledge, I cannot in good conscience allow you to move through this court unprotected. I hope you understand that this caution comes from wanting to see you safe, not from doubting your strength. She nodded slowly, though the tightness in her chest did not fully ease. Over the following days, she noticed the increased presence of guards trailing her through the stronghold's halls, watched Finn's easy manner grow subtly more alert whenever they crossed paths with unfamiliar wolves, felt the weight of a danger she could not yet see, but had begun, uncomfortably, to sense in every shadowed corner of the capital. It was during one of her training sessions with Mira, nearly 2 weeks after the revelation in the archive, that the first concrete sign of trouble arrived. Your footwork is better, Mira observed, circling her slowly across the training yard. But you're still hesitating before you commit to a strike. That hesitation will cost you, if you're ever facing someone who actually intends to hurt you. I know, Elira said, frustration edging into her voice as she reset her stance. I'm trying. Trying isn't enough when someone is trying to kill you. Mira's expression sharpened, something serious replacing her usual patient instruction. Which is why I need you to understand something, Elira, and I need you to take it seriously. Word reached me this morning, through channels I trust, that at least 2 rival territories have learned of your bloodline in the past week. One of them has a history of eliminating threats before they can fully develop. I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because you need to train like your life depends on it, because it very well might. Elira felt the training yard grow suddenly colder, despite the mild afternoon sun. Does Cale know? He knows, Mira confirmed. He's the one who told me to accelerate your training. Which is exactly what we're going to do, starting now. The weeks that followed blurred into a relentless rhythm of training and vigilance. Elira's days consumed by drills that left her exhausted but steadily, undeniably stronger, her wolf responding to the intensified instruction in ways that surprised even Mira. She began to notice changes in herself beyond simple physical skill, a sharper awareness of her surroundings, a growing confidence in her own reflexes, a wolf inside her that no longer curled away from confrontation but rose, cautiously, to meet it. Cale's presence during this period became both a comfort and a complication she found herself increasingly unable to ignore. He sought her out more frequently now, whether to check on her training or simply to share a quiet meal in his study after long days spent managing the growing political tension her existence had unknowingly created. Their conversations, once careful and formal, had settled into an easy familiarity that Elira treasured more than she was willing to fully admit, even to herself. It was during one such evening, the two of them sharing a simple meal by the fire, while rain fell steadily against the study's windows, that the careful distance they had both maintained finally began to fully dissolve. "You seem different tonight," Cale observed, watching her with the quiet attentiveness that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Tired," Illyra admitted, though it was only partly true. "Mira had me sparring for 3 hours today. I think I have bruises in places I didn't know could bruise." Something that was almost a smile touched Cale's mouth. "She tells me you disarmed one of her senior guards yesterday. That's no small accomplishment, particularly this early in your training." "He let me win," Illyra said, though warmth spread through her chest at the observation anyway. "He did not," Cale said, with enough certainty that she found herself believing him. "I know that guard. He does not let anyone win, regardless of rank or circumstance. You earned that victory yourself." He studied her for a moment longer, something warm and unguarded in his expression that made her breath catch unexpectedly. "You've changed so much since that first day in the courtyard, Illyra. I find myself in awe of it, more often than I probably should admit." The words settled between them, quiet and significant, and Illyra found herself unable to look away from him, aware suddenly of how close they sat, of the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face, of the careful restraint she had noticed building between them for weeks, finally beginning to fray at the edges. "Cale," she said softly, uncertain even what she meant to say, only that something needed to be said. "I know," he said, before she could find the words, his voice low and rough, in a way she had never heard from him before. "I have known for some time now, Illyra, that what I feel for you has grown well beyond the boundaries of guardianship. I have told myself, repeatedly, that it would be wiser to keep that feeling contained, given everything else weighing on you right now. But I find myself increasingly unable to manage that discipline when you are near me." Illyra felt her heart pounding, uncertain and hopeful in equal measure. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "I've felt it for weeks. I just didn't know if it was appropriate to say." Something in Cale's expression broke open at that, warm and relieved, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet study filled only with the sound of rain and the soft crackle of the fire between them. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers lingering with a tenderness that made her breath catch entirely. "I do not know what the future holds for either of us," he said quietly. "Not with the danger gathering around your bloodline, not with the political complications my own position creates, but I know that whatever happens, I want to face it with you beside me, not simply as someone under my protection, but as someone I have come, against every careful instinct I once trusted, to care for more deeply than I expected possible." "Then let's face it together," Illyra said, and meant it fully. The fear that had been building steadily across the past weeks tempered, if not fully erased, by the quiet certainty of the man sitting beside her. Neither of them could have known, in that peaceful, firelit moment, how soon that resolve would be tested, nor how close the danger gathering beyond the stronghold's walls had already drawn. The diplomatic gathering had been planned for months before Illyra's arrival at the capital, a formal summit bringing together representatives from every allied territory to negotiate trade agreements and border arrangements for the coming year. Cale had considered excluding her from the event entirely, given the growing tension surrounding her bloodline, but had ultimately decided that hiding her away would only confirm to watching enemies that she was something worth hunting. "If you disappear from public view now," he had explained the night before, "it tells anyone paying attention that we believe the threat is real and immediate. I would rather project strength and readiness than fear." Illyra had agreed, though the decision left an uneasy weight in her stomach as she dressed for the summit the following evening, the training she had undergone across the past weeks feeling suddenly, uncomfortably insufficient against whatever danger might be waiting among the gathered dignitaries. The summit hall was even grander than the one used for the autumn gathering weeks earlier, filled with representatives from a dozen territories, their guards stationed carefully at the edges of the room, their conversations a low, constant murmur beneath the formal proceedings taking place at the hall's center. Illyra remained close to Cale's side throughout the evening, acutely aware of Finn's watchful presence just behind her, and of the additional guards Mira had insisted accompany them despite the summit's supposedly neutral, protected status. The evening passed without incident for its first several hours. Formal negotiations, giving way gradually to a more relaxed banquet, as representatives mingled and exchanged pleasantries beneath the hall's high ceiling. Illyra found herself relaxing slightly, beginning to believe that perhaps her caution, and Cale's, had been unnecessary this time. She was wrong. It happened quickly, the way violence often does, without the dramatic warning stories tend to promise. Illyra had stepped away from Cale's side only briefly, moving toward the edge of the hall to find a quiet moment away from the crush of unfamiliar faces, when she felt it. A sharp, sudden wrongness in the air, the particular stillness of a predator closing in on prey too distracted to notice. She turned, just as a figure emerged from the shadowed alcove beside her, moving with a speed and precision that told her immediately this was no drunken noble or overzealous admirer. Her training took over, before conscious thought could catch up, her body twisting instinctively away from the strike aimed at her, though not quickly enough to avoid it entirely. Pain bloomed sharp along her side as something caught her, and she stumbled back, her vision narrowing with sudden sharp focus, even as her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. "Cale!" The name tore from her throat, before she consciously decided to shout it, her hands pressing instinctively against the wound at her side, as her attacker moved to close the distance again. What happened next unfolded in a blur of chaos. Finn was there almost immediately, placing himself between Illyra and her attacker, with a speed that spoke of years of trained instinct, his own weapon meeting the assassins in a clash that rang sharply across the now silent hall. Guards converged from every direction, the earlier pleasant murmur of the banquet erupting into panic and shouted alarm, and through it all, Illyra felt herself sinking slowly toward the floor, her vision beginning to blur at the edges, as the pain in her side deepened into something distant and cold. Cale reached her within seconds, though it felt to Illyra like an eternity had passed, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, as he dropped to his knees beside her, hands immediately pressing over the wound at her side, with a desperate, focused urgency. "Stay with me," he said, his voice carrying a rawness she had never heard from him before, stripped entirely of the careful composure he wore for the rest of the world. "Illyra, look at me. Stay with me." "I'm here," she managed, though the words came out weaker than she intended, the edges of the hall beginning to swim strangely in her vision. "It's not as bad as it looks, I don't think." "Do not lie to me right now," Cale said, something fierce and frightened beneath the command in his voice. He turned, shouting orders to the guards gathering around them with a sharpness that sent several scrambling immediately to obey, for healers, for reinforced security, for the immediate lockdown of every exit from the summit hall. The assassin, Illyra learned later, had been captured alive, though he had said little before dying of injuries sustained during his attempted escape. His identity and allegiance ultimately traced back to a territory that had, for generations, harbored deep resentment toward the ancient bloodline her family had once carried. Whoever had sent him had clearly decided that eliminating the threat before it could be restored was preferable to allowing it to grow unchecked. Illyra spent the following days in and out of consciousness, the wound at her side deeper than she had initially realized, her body's weakened connection to her wolf making healing slower and more difficult than it would have been for someone with a fully restored bloodline. Cale rarely left her side during that time. She would learn afterward from Finn, refusing meetings, delaying diplomatic obligations, sitting through long hours at her bedside with a focused, grim determination that unsettled even his most senior advisors. When she finally woke fully, 3 days after the attack, it was to find him seated beside her bed, exhaustion carved deep into his features, his hand wrapped carefully around hers, as though he had been holding it for some time. "You're awake," he said, relief flooding his voice, as his grip on her hand tightened gently. "How long was I out?" she asked, her voice rough and unfamiliar to her own ears. 3 days. Something dark passed behind his eyes at the memory. 3 of the longest days of my life. Illyra studied him carefully, noting the hollowed exhaustion in his face, the tension that had not fully left his shoulders despite her waking. "You've been here the whole time." "Where else would I be?" The question carried more weight than its simplicity suggested, and Illyra felt something in her chest tighten at the raw honesty in his voice. "Illyra, I nearly lost you. In a hall full of guards, surrounded by more security than most gatherings ever require, someone still managed to get close enough to hurt you badly enough that I genuinely did not know. for a long stretch of those 3 days, whether you would wake at all. I'm here, she said softly, echoing her words from the night of the attack, though this time her voice carried more strength. I'm not going anywhere. Something fierce and fragile moved across Cale's face, and he leaned forward slowly, resting his forehead gently against hers, his breath unsteady, in a way she had never witnessed from him before. I cannot keep protecting you like this, he said quietly. Guards, reinforced security, careful vigilance, none of it was enough to stop what happened 3 nights ago, and I have no confidence it will be enough the next time someone decides your unrestored bloodline is a threat worth eliminating. What are you saying? Elira asked, though some part of her had already begun to guess the answer, remembering the conversation in the archive weeks earlier. Cale pulled back slightly, meeting her eyes with a seriousness that left no room for misunderstanding. I am saying that I believe it is time to consider the ritual. To restore your bloodline fully, rather than leaving you vulnerable, half-suppressed, unable to defend yourself with the full strength that should have always been yours. His jaw tightened, old fear resurfacing, despite his obvious conviction. I know it is dangerous. I know the records warn that your body might not survive a sudden restoration after generations of suppression. But Elira, I have spent 3 days sitting beside a bed, wondering if I would lose you to an assassin's blade, because your strength has been stolen from you since before you were even born, and I find I would rather risk the danger of restoration than continue watching you remain vulnerable to threats you should never have had to face at all. Elira absorbed this, the weight of the choice settling heavily over her despite her body's continued weakness. She thought of 19 years spent believing herself fundamentally, permanently weak, of the courtyard where she had been struck down while a crowd laughed, of the assassin's blade that had come dangerously close to ending everything before she had truly begun to understand who she might become. I want to do it, she said finally, her voice steady, despite the fear coiled tightly in her chest. I'm tired of being someone that needs protecting. I want to be someone who can protect herself, and the people I care about, instead. Cale studied her for a long moment, something proud and terrified moving simultaneously behind his dark eyes, before he nodded slowly, accepting her decision, even as it clearly frightened him more than he was willing to fully admit. Then we will prepare, he said quietly, as carefully and safely as such a dangerous ritual can be prepared for. And whatever happens, Elira, I will not leave your side, not for a single moment, until it is done. The chamber prepared for the ritual lay deep beneath the stronghold, older even than the archive where Elira had first learned the truth of her bloodline. Its stone walls carved with symbols, Mira explained had not been used in active practice for generations. Elira stood at its center 3 weeks after the attack, her wound fully healed, though the memory of it lingered sharply, surrounded by the small, trusted circle Cale had assembled for what was to come. Mira, whose knowledge of old rituals had proven essential in preparing the ceremony safely. Finn, standing guard at the chamber's entrance with grim determination, and Cale himself, refusing, as promised, to leave her side. I need you to understand the risk, one final time, Mira said, her expression serious, as she circled the chamber, checking each carved symbol with careful, practiced attention. Once we begin, there is no stopping partway through. Your body will either adjust to the sudden return of your bloodline's full strength, or it will not survive the shock of it. I have done everything I can to minimize that risk, but I cannot eliminate it entirely. I understand, Elira said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that her voice did not shake. Weeks of training, of learning to trust the strength building steadily within her, had settled something in her that even the danger of this moment could not fully unsettle. Cale stood close beside her, his hand finding hers, his grip firm despite the tension visible in every line of his body. You do not have to do this, he said quietly, for perhaps the 10th time since they had begun preparations. We could find another way. More guards, more careful vigilance. We already tried that, Elira reminded him gently. It nearly cost me my life anyway. I would rather face this risk now, on my own terms, than keep waiting for the next attack to find me unprepared. Something in Cale's expression tightened, torn between pride and fear, before he nodded slowly, accepting a decision he clearly still struggled with, even after weeks of preparation. Then let us begin, he said, though his hand did not loosen its grip on hers. Mira began the ritual with careful, measured words, ancient and unfamiliar, drawn from records so old that even she admitted uncertainty about pronouncing them precisely as intended. The symbols carved into the chamber's floor began to glow faintly as she spoke, a soft, silvery light that seemed to rise from the stone itself, gathering slowly around where Alira stood at the chamber's center. The first sensation was subtle, a warmth spreading through her chest that felt almost pleasant, like sunlight after a long winter. But as Mira's words continued, growing more intense, the warmth sharpened rapidly into something closer to fire, spreading outward through her limbs, with an intensity that made her breath catch sharply. "Something's happening," she managed, her voice tight with the effort of remaining upright as the sensation intensified further. "Stay with it," Mira said, her own voice tense with focused concentration, never breaking the rhythm of the ritual words. "Whatever you feel, don't fight it. Your body needs to accept the return of what was taken, not resist it." Alira closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe through the building intensity, remembering every lesson Mira had taught her about trusting her own instincts, rather than the fear that had governed her for 19 years. Somewhere distant, she was aware of Kale's hand tightening around hers, his voice murmuring something low and steady that she could not fully make out through the roaring building in her ears. The fire spreading through her body reached a peak so sharp it tore a cry from her throat, her knees buckling beneath the intensity of it, only for Kale's arms to catch her immediately, holding her upright as the ritual continued around them both. For a long, terrifying moment, Alira felt herself teetering on some invisible edge, her body straining under the weight of a strength it had never been permitted to hold, uncertain whether it would rise to meet that strength or break beneath it entirely. Then, somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. It was unlike anything she had ever felt, not the small, quiet wolf that had lived curled and frightened inside her for her entire life, but something vast and ancient, waking fully for the first time in generations, unfurling within her with a power that stole the breath entirely from her lungs. The fire that had felt like it might consume her, instead began to settle, spreading through her body not as pain but as strength, filling every corner of her that had once felt hollow and weak with something solid, certain, entirely her own. The silvery light filling the chamber flared once, brilliant and blinding, before fading gradually into stillness. Alira opened her eyes slowly, aware immediately that something fundamental had changed within her, a quiet hum of power beneath her skin that had never existed there before. "Alira." Kale's voice was rough with barely restrained emotion as he studied her face carefully, searching for any sign of the harm they had all feared might come. "How do you feel?" She considered the question carefully, taking stock of the strange, powerful stillness now settled within her chest. "Different," she said finally. "Stronger. Like I can finally feel my own wolf clearly for the first time in my life." Mira approached slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and open astonishment as she studied Alira with careful, assessing eyes. "The ritual succeeded," she said, something like wonder entering her voice. "Fully succeeded. I have never seen a suppression this deep, reversed so completely." Alira felt the truth of it settling through her body with each passing moment, a strength she had never known, steady and certain beneath her skin, her wolf no longer small and frightened but vast and quietly powerful, finally free after generations of forced silence. She flexed her fingers slowly, marveling at the simple, profound difference in how her own body felt beneath her command. "I feel like myself," she said softly, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, "for the first time in my entire life." Kale pulled her gently into his arms, careful despite her obvious returning strength, his relief palpable in the way he held her, his voice rough against her hair. "I am so proud of you," he murmured. "You have no idea how proud I am." They remained like that for a long moment, the chamber quiet around them, the weight of 19 years of false weakness finally, fully lifted. But even as Alira allowed herself to feel the full relief of the moment, some careful, trained part of her mind was already turning toward what came next, toward Callum's warnings, toward the assassin who had nearly succeeded weeks earlier, toward the rival territories that had feared her bloodline enough to suppress it in the first place, and would now, surely, fear it even more with its power fully restored. Whatever peace this moment offered, she understood clearly, would not last uncontested. The true test of her newfound strength, she suspected, still waited ahead. She did not yet know how soon, nor how directly, that test would arrive. Word of Alira's restored bloodline could not be contained within the stronghold for long, and within days, Kale received formal word that the territory responsible for the earlier assassination attempt had grown bold enough to send a delegation, ostensibly for diplomatic purposes, though everyone in the capital understood the true intention lurking beneath their polite request for an audience. They want to assess the threat directly, Kale explained, pacing his study with barely contained frustration, as Alira, Mira, and Finn gathered to discuss the situation, to see for themselves whether the restoration truly succeeded, and to determine what response they believe is necessary. Meaning another attempt, Finn said grimly. Meaning we should assume the worst and prepare accordingly, Mira added, already turning her attention toward Alira with careful assessment. How do you feel? Truly, the restoration was only days ago, and I won't pretend I fully understand the limits of your new strength yet. Alira considered the question seriously, reaching inward toward the steady, powerful hum that had settled beneath her skin since the ritual. Strong, she said finally, with a certainty that surprised even herself. Stronger than I've ever felt in my life. I don't fully understand it yet either, but I trust it. Kale studied her for a long moment, something proud and worried warring behind his dark eyes. The delegation arrives in 3 days. I intend to receive them formally, in the Great Hall, with full security present. I will not hide you away, Alira, not this time. If they have come to assess whether you represent a threat worth eliminating, I would rather they see clearly, from the beginning, that any attempt against you now will be met with consequences they cannot survive. The following days passed in careful preparation, Alira training intensely with Mira, to better understand the full extent of her restored strength, while Kale and his advisors worked to ensure the stronghold's security could not be breached as it had been during the earlier summit. By the time the delegation's arrival drew near, Alira found herself standing in the Great Hall beside Kale, with a confidence that would have been unimaginable to her only months earlier, her wolf settled and certain beneath her calm exterior. The delegation, led by a sharp-eyed alpha named Dorian Castell, arrived with the careful, measured politeness of representatives testing dangerous ground, their eyes moving repeatedly to Alira throughout the formal greetings, with poorly concealed calculation. We have heard remarkable claims, Castell said eventually, once formalities had been observed, his gaze fixed directly on Alira with open scrutiny, that the suppressed Voss bloodline has been fully restored. Forgive my territory's caution, but history has taught us the danger of allowing such power to grow unchecked. The suppression your territory helped enforce, Kale said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath its careful diplomacy, was placed on an innocent bloodline out of fear, not justice. Alira has done nothing across her entire life to warrant the cruelty inflicted upon her family for generations. If your territory came here today, intending to repeat that cruelty, I would advise reconsidering, given what nearly happened to your last attempt. Castell's eyes narrowed slightly, though he said nothing to directly confirm his territory's involvement in the earlier assassination attempt. We came only to observe, he said carefully, to determine for ourselves whether the old fears remain justified. Then observe, Alira said, stepping forward before Kale could respond, her voice steady and clear across the silent hall. Every eye in the room turned toward her, and for the first time in her life, she did not shrink beneath that attention. I am not a threat to anyone who does not threaten me first. I have spent 19 years living with a strength stolen from me by people too frightened to let my family exist freely. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve the strength that was always mine to begin with, to people who never once tried to know me before deciding I was dangerous. Silence stretched through the hall following her words, and Alira held Castell's gaze steadily, refusing to look away, her wolf calm and certain beneath her composed exterior. Something shifted in the alpha's expression, surprise giving way slowly to something closer to reluctant respect. You speak with more confidence than I expected, Castell admitted eventually. I've had good teachers, Alira said, glancing briefly toward Mira and Kale, before returning her attention fully to the delegation. And I've learned, finally, what it feels like to stand on my own strength, instead of waiting for someone else to decide my worth. The negotiations that followed stretched across several tense hours, Kale navigating the delicate political balance with careful precision, ultimately securing an agreement that Castel's territory would recognize Alira's restored bloodline without further hostility, in exchange for assurances that her strength would not be used to threaten existing territorial boundaries. It was not a perfect resolution, Alira understood, listening to the careful diplomatic language exchanged between Kale and Castel, but it was a genuine one, built on mutual recognition rather than fear alone. By the time the delegation departed 3 days later, the immediate threat against her had eased considerably, though Alira understood that vigilance would remain necessary for some time to come. Political tensions like this rarely resolved themselves entirely, and there would likely be other territories, other ambitious wolves, who would test the boundaries of what her restored strength meant for the wider balance of power across the northern territories. But standing in the quiet gardens that evening, Kale beside her beneath a sky finally clear of the tension that had gathered over recent weeks, Alira found herself unable to focus on the uncertainty still ahead. She thought instead of how far she had traveled since that first humiliating fall in Moonfall's training yard, of the king, who had looked past her weakness to see something worth protecting, of the strength she had reclaimed, not just through an ancient ritual, but through months of careful, deliberate work, to become someone worthy of standing beside him as an equal, rather than someone perpetually in need of rescue. "You did something remarkable today," Kale said quietly, watching her with the same warm, unguarded expression she had come to treasure over the months since her arrival. "I have negotiated with difficult territories my entire life, and I have rarely seen anyone shift the tone of a room the way you did today." "I had good motivation," Alira said, smiling faintly. "I'm tired of being underestimated." "You will never be underestimated again," Kale said, something fierce and certain in his voice. "Not while I have any say in it." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the commanding presence he showed the rest of the world. "Alira, I have known since that first day in the courtyard that you were someone extraordinary, long before I understood the truth of your bloodline. I do not want you beside me because of what your ancestors were, or because of the strength you have reclaimed. I want you beside me because of who you have always been, underneath every layer of cruelty this world tried to convince you was deserved." Alira felt tears gathering, warm and unashamed, as she looked up at him, beneath the darkening sky. "I want to be beside you too," she said softly, "not as someone you protect, as someone who stands with you." "As an equal," Kale said, something like wonder entering his voice as he studied her. "That is exactly what you are, Alira. It is what you have always deserved to be." He kissed her then, gentle and certain, the culmination of months spent slowly, carefully building something neither of them had expected to find. Not a king rescuing a helpless Omega, but two people who had found, in each other, a partnership built on genuine respect and hard-won trust. Around them, the gardens settled into quiet evening stillness, the same gardens where Callum had once tried to plant doubt in her heart, where she had once sat wondering if she would ever truly belong anywhere. She belonged here now. Not because a king had claimed her, but because she had claimed herself first, reclaiming a strength stolen generations before she was born, and choosing, deliberately, to stand beside the man who had seen her worth before she had ever seen it herself. The weakest Omega in Moonfall pack was gone, replaced by someone the entire Northern Territories would soon learn never to underestimate again. And beside her, steady and unwavering, stood the Alpha King who had once declared, before an entire pack, that anyone who dared touch her would answer to him directly, a promise he had kept, and would continue keeping, for as long as they both stood together. Their story, born from a single act of cruelty in a forgotten pack's training yard, had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined that first day. It had become a beginning, not an ending, the start of a partnership strong enough to reshape the balance of power across the Northern Territories, built on a foundation of respect neither of them would ever again allow the world to diminish.